Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm, and we're pleased to have you joining us for this New Jersey MEP Lessons Learned webinar. This webinar is one of our monthly series of webinars that we conduct in conjunction with the New Jersey MEP. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. The presentation today is not complete without accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product that we review must be considered in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel. And the information given and comments made should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. Our topic today is Crisis Management Lessons Learned. Our presenter is Jim Satterfield, President, Chief Operating Officer, and co-founder of Firestorm. The webinar series is underwritten by the New Jersey MEP, which we are pleased to have as a partner in today's webinar. Our moderators are Joe Caratanudo. He's with the New Jersey MEP, Lead Contingency and Disaster Planning, and Blair Neville, a principal of Firestorm located in New Jersey. Joe, Blair, over to you, please.
Just to kind of give a quick overview for those that are not familiar, New Jersey MEP is, our mission is really to focus in on helping manufacturers in the state to become more productive, more efficient, and more globally competitive. And we do it through a host of different services that we provide, things like energy management. We assist companies in getting R&D tax credits. We help with things like lean manufacturing, process improvement, Six Sigma, in addition to helping companies get certification for things like ISO 9001 and other ISO certifications. But we also help out, excuse me, on the commercial side of the business with things like strategic planning and business development and assisting companies with innovation, and of course assisting companies in helping them to create business continuity plans, which brings us back to Blair. Blair?
Great. Joe, thank you very much. We appreciate the opportunity to help out NJ MEP. I just want to make one comment in that one of the things that we find when we deal with a great deal of our customers is that, and our clients, is that most people have never had the opportunity, and I guess it's good, to actually have dealt with and managed through a crisis. So the focus of this webinar is just that. One of the things that I think makes Firestorm unique is we have the expertise and experts as part of our business that have dealt with crisis, have been on the ground, and have had real-life experience in a variety of industries and events. So I think this webinar is an opportunity to hear some of those stories, have some of the learnings that we've had, and be able to share those. So I think for people on the webinar today, this is a good opportunity to pick up some good information from someone who has been there and has done it, and that's the purpose of today's webinar. And again, I want to thank NJ MEP for helping us put this together for everybody. Jim?
Oh, thanks. And I think, Blair, that lead-in just makes it reinforce the old and decrepit comment. I think as we look at this, and we look at what's going on around the country with the polar vortex coming in and rolling down into the U.S., I talked to somebody yesterday in Buffalo, New York, who has, it's a narrow band, but they have 6 feet of snow yesterday within a 24-hour period because they're right in the center of the band, and are anticipating another 2 to 3 feet today. That's a different kind of a crisis as we think about it. And we're going to talk about those types of things that can happen physically, that can occur, as well as things that can impact the brand and reputation or even the safety of your people as we go forward. And I guess the one commonality between all of them as we think about crises in general are the worst crisis that you'll ever see is the one that happens to you or your people. it's easy to think about these things in the abstract. Other people, other areas, well, if that had happened to me, I would do this. Until it happens to you, you don't really understand what it is you would do or what you would be able to think to do. And that's the reason and the value of the planning that Joe and Blair were discussing as we led in. And it's not that these things are impossible, that they won't occur. It's that in many cases we just think that they're unthinkable. I won't let myself go there and think about what happens if we have an episode of workplace violence in our business, or what happens if this hurricane comes up the coast and slams into our area. There was a novel this year, another from Dan Brown. He's a prolific writer and writes very involved stories and does a tremendous amount of research. You may remember the Da Vinci Code is one of those. His novel that came out this year is called Inferno, and it's it has as a reference theme back the Divine Comedy, Inferno, written by Dante. And it talks about those areas. But within the book, the quotes that you see came up as they were describing what people were trying to process and look at. And it says that we all have a defense mechanism that lets us say, hey, there's too much stress here, and we just negate it because I don't want to have to handle that and do it. And probably all of us have seen in our companies individuals that manifest that, or maybe have people like that in our extended families. But it's a critical part of a coping mechanism that allows us to continue to function by pushing those thoughts out of our minds and then focusing on the things that we can handle. So the first lesson that I think we would learn as we talk today about crisis management is that people reject the possibility that these events will occur. We even see it in the area of communicable illness, where people feel like, well, there'll never be a pandemic. And then there are 3 pandemics a century for back through recorded times that we can identify. Look at the trauma that's occurred this year as we've seen the Ebola outbreak, and clearly this is a serious situation in Africa. And it's only a few cases here in the U.S. We've just had 2 deaths, but it's been limited within the people who've had the direct contact with the sick individuals. It's not been a spontaneous development of clusters as a result of reinfections. And so we tend to push these things away from us and not think about them. So every day in America, there are companies in crisis. We deal a lot with insurance companies and helping them deal with the impacts that are associated with it. Well, how can you say every day that a company's in crisis? Well, the Red Cross points out that there are over 70,000 disasters annually in the United States. It's almost 200 a day. When you think about that, and that not every one of them is an earthquake or a tornado or a hurricane or a flood, the majority are fires, and more people die from drowning in floods than any of the others that we're associated with it. But that's a fairly often event. You add to that the 2 million episodes of workplace violence annually in the United States. Well, those clearly have the potential to be a crisis as they would come together. And we've seen those play out not only in businesses like we have on our call today, but in schools across the country. And that's a parent's worst nightmare to think about it. We add to that the industrial accidents that occur, the accidents in the workplace that can happen, the communicable illness, and now you start to see this is not that rare event, it's a common event. And I think that's the other lesson that I'd like you to start to think about. And it only becomes a crisis if you haven't planned for it and you haven't practiced what you need to do. Now, a crisis is not business as usual, it's business as unusual. It's business that is completely different from what we would normally expect and see and do, and what we normally, actions we would take don't apply. It's business as unusual. So beforehand, we do the pre-action. We're identifying what the risks are, we're quantifying those, we're developing strategies, we're training our people, we're testing our plans, all of that happening before. During the actual onset of the crisis, we're focused on our emergency response. And those actions are actually fairly simple. That's one of the easiest things that you'll find within your company. We can shelter in place if the threat outside the building is greater than the threat inside. We can do a lockout if there's a violence that could be coming in We can do a lockdown if we feel the threat is inside our buildings. Or if the threat is worse inside than it is outside, we'll do an evacuation. Those 4 actions will drive what we do, and we're focused here on life and health, immediate and safety in this immediate area. After the crisis, we have consequence management. That's what does it mean? What are the impacts associated with our companies? And Blair and Joe can certainly talk with you about a business impact analysis, defining what could happen within our company. What would the impacts be? What do we monitor? What are the triggers that would carry us forward? So that leads us to the thought about today, what's foreseeable and what's going to happen as a result of that. So today everything is foreseeable and anyone may be held accountable. And there are numerous examples where, well, let's go back to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. That was the truck bomb down in the garage of the building. When the terrorists got out, 2 people had died. There had been damage conducted in that area. They caught them. There was a criminal trial. They were found guilty, sentenced to jail. But there was a civil trial that most people do not recall. In the civil trial, the jury awarded damages as follows: 2/3 of the liability to the building owner, 1/3 of the liability to the terrorist. Wait a minute. How can that be? How come the people that own the building are more liable than the person who tried to blow it up? Well, the rationale behind that was this was an identifiable risk and threat, and therefore there was an obligation to protect everyone in the building, the tenants, the public. And so then the liability flowed back. Well, if you're on the call today and you own a plant or you lease a space, you have that liability associated with it. And again, you unfortunately become the deep pocket where these areas are done. So there is a legal precedent here, as OSHA has defined a lot of these hazards in the workplace and requires you to have a safe environment for your people. So we talked about those 3 areas, pre-action, during the event, and after. Now we really divide that into 5 stages of escalation. This is a way for you to look at your business and understand how all these various plans fit in to respond to the crisis. The crisis management portion of this would be the senior leadership within your company, dealing with what the impacts and the consequences are. Your safety people will be focused around the emergency response plan. Your fire coordinator or your searcher or your rescuer associated with it. The business continuity plans are back to either your company as a whole or individual departments in your company. If you have a larger structure, what is it going to take to get purchasing back up? What is it going to take to get the manufacturing back started, or the delivery or the warehouse, in each of those areas as we focus through it. So the majority of the work in crisis preparation is done in this pre-action area, putting in the structure, establishing what the event activation matrix would be. What do you need to do and carry forward? And fortunately, if you define these areas of impact and then define how people know that they're starting to occur, you've set together a pattern that will tell us what we need to do at each particular point along the way. So when we look at our companies, they're circles, and these circles overlap as we think about it. So whether it's a disaster or a disruption or a crisis, it comes in and it could strike the company directly, or it could hit the families and friends of employees. It could hit critical suppliers, and all of those impacts will come down today. Just as we were starting the call today, Joe was sharing that his father, 92 years old, but he's not one of my contemporaries, I would like to point out, has a significant leak in the steam heating system in his house. Well, that's clearly a crisis for Joe's dad, and that crisis impacts him because he needs to go there and help and work together. Family trumps job. That's the other major lesson to learn as we're thinking about crisis. People put family first and job second. That's why it's important that you make sure that all of your employees have a disaster plan at home. And if you would like to know how to do that, you can go to the Firestorm website, and there's a book there called Disaster Ready People for a Disaster Ready America, and it outlines what you need to build a plan at home. Now, when we think about a disaster or a crisis, there are a lot of attributes that flow out very quickly, and this leads to the conclusion that it is not business as usual, and therefore you have to take a different approach, the escalating flow of events, the loss of command and control. If there's a disaster occurring at your location, the police or the fire are going to take it over. You're no longer in control of your property. How you respond can create that second crisis. Brand and reputation are under attack, and it's going to be a situation that it's going to involve your people. Every crisis is a human crisis. It's great for us to sit here and talk about this in the abstract, but when Joe got the call about his dad, that overrode everything else that was being in his mind and consideration at that point in time. The same thing will be true. It's easy to be together until it's your people and you're seeing this happen in those areas. The last, that it comes as a surprise. You weren't in your calendar and your appointment list today. I have a colleague that I work with. His name is Misan. Misan and I have been trading some emails about working together on a particular area, and then all of a sudden, kaboom, things happen, and that schedule gets thrown one way or another. I often tell everyone the last time a surprise was good, I was 5 and it was my birthday. When you think about at work and someone comes running into your office, it's clearly not a good thing. It's a bad thing. Most everything you learn initially in this crisis will be wrong, in that you're used to being able to make decisions based upon accurate information, facts, numbers, metrics. How do we carry this forward? But what you learn in the first 24 hours, it will in fact be wrong. You don't have to look much further than the evening news as breaking events are coming out and are being shared, and then the next day you find out, well, it wasn't quite that way, it was this way. And those will make a difference. That's why having structure here makes such a big difference in what you're doing, because you can't rely on the information to make the decision. You have to then have predetermined what actions you're going to take, another key lesson learned. And in the following years that comes from this event will become the consequences. It's not a matter that, okay, it's over, now what do we do? Firestorm's working with a company that's a technology firm, and they have their customers depend upon their services in order to be able to run their individual businesses. If suddenly they lose a data center, those customers are down, and it will directly impact those clients, and that becomes a significant problem for them. And they may never get those clients back. And so the consequences for a disruption, for a crisis that were to occur, would have consequences that would last for years. Generally in a crisis, the time frame of the crisis is very short, the active shooter on site. But the consequences of that will last for years to come. If I say the name Virginia Tech, you will immediately think about the shootings that occurred there in 2007. We're soon to be 8 years from that event, but yet it's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the name. If I were to say Penn State, you might think of the football program, but then you might think of Jerry Sandusky and the events that occurred there. Brand and reputation can be impacted for years to come. So a crisis environment is important for you to be looking at what's going on at that point in time. And it's the ability to have been there before and seen that together. The person who's responsible for this within your organization, or maybe the people that you're using from the outside, and what crises have they managed? Because this is a different environment. Remember, the information is wrong. Facts are occurring very quickly, and that changes. So as you look at these questions here, there's this confusion of what do we do now? What do we monitor? What do we say? Since the information is wrong, the monitoring becomes absolutely critical to clarify the actions and the words that you say. So another lesson is focusing on the monitoring, because the facts will change and become clearer, and then the directions and actions that you need to take become certainly much more straightforward. So crisis management, the plan details manner, and it needs to tell you how to do things, not what to do. That's a major differentiator in plans, whether it's business continuity, crisis management, or a variety of the other areas. If your plan shows somebody what to do, but not how to do it, then there'll be confusion and the wrong things will occur at the time you can least afford to have those happen. Documenting those responses, monitoring, and having messages prepared in advance is easier to edit than it is to create. And don't assume just because you talked everyone through this once in your company that they will remember at a time when it's the most critical. And invariably, as Firestorm is called in to assist in a crisis, and you would think, well, no one would ever do whatever it is that they did. And you find, yep, they did it, and in fact, it was worse. And we've seen statements made that you would not believe that a firm would say or release at that point in time. And we'll talk a little bit more about communications toward the end of our conversation today. But focusing then on the how you do it. Read your plan. If you just read this, what are the steps that you would take to make the what that you've been talking about occur? That key differentiator is a way to assure that you have the best possible chance as the crisis events incur. Now, business intelligence is a key element associated with this. All of you that are on the call today have your own companies. You're making products. You're distributing them. You're building an organization over time as those elements are occurring. You know who your competitors are. You know what the pricing in the marketplace would be. You know what features and benefits that your products and services have compared to the others. You know where the price points would fall and how you can win an account. You also understand that if you lose favor with a customer, it's going to be very difficult to get them back. So the key here in running any organization, and particularly an organization that could face the potential crisis, and unfortunately we all do that, is that we need to know today what will happen tomorrow. Now, sort of hiring someone with a crystal ball sitting in your office or going to a palm reader and having that interpretation included so that you could implement that into your plan, we're seeing that there are tools that you can use to get intelligence about what's going on. And we're going to talk about creating an intelligence network that can supply you the critical information you need before the events occur. And that's a combination of tools that you bring together and is a responsibility of management to make sure that you do have the business intelligence that you need at the time you need it to make those appropriate decisions as they come together. Firestorm does that through a predict, plan, perform process. Predict what the vulnerabilities and threats are, identify what the impacts would be, establish how you monitor for those, and then clearly identify the triggers. If you're monitoring and you see this, then you know that it has occurred or will occur shortly. And then the plans in all of the areas, and then the perform is the training, the exercising, the arranging of supplies to come together. And so what this all comes together is to transform uncertainty into certainty within your business, because there will become a problem. For you to think that you can go in an entire career without one of those episodes happening will be very difficult to imagine. And then what are the metrics? How do we know, in fact, that we're doing what we think that we're doing? So we're going to establish a framework. We're going to identify the risk involved, and then we're going to manage and mitigate those risks in a crisis management environment and in a planning coordination. So can you identify your organization's next crisis? We can, but more importantly, you need to be able to do that. And so if we look at this is a combination of factors, and we're going to step you through those areas as we carry forward. Now, there are always going to be warning signs. There will be indicators that you need to look at, and that's how you can really predict a crisis. When you look at it in the area of fraud, that could clearly be a crisis that would be involved. But what are the tools? How do you monitor in those areas to determine it? If you see someone that has felt that they've been wronged and they've had violent tendencies, Firestorm responded to a vocational school this year, and we got a phone call that they were concerned about an individual that was in the vocational school. It was a 12-month program, and as a result of that, he had served in Iran and Iraq, 2 tours as he came back. He had post-traumatic stress syndrome. He had violence issues in class. He had a student came forward that said that she felt threatened and stalked by this individual. And as you started going through, he was a loner. He had a fascination with guns. you started looking at that and you go, wow, those are all warning signs that there's a potential. And he had to be asked on several occasions to step out of the class, but they allowed him to continue to go there. So those were warning signs that actions need to be taken. Now, that was a fairly obvious one, apparently, but it was not obvious to them at that point in time. The good news is that we were able to intervene, and we did a behavioral risk threat assessment. We call that a BERTHA process, B-E-R-T-H-A. That's the acronym for Behavioral Risk Threat Assessment, to identify the behaviors of concern and then help to manage a plan on how to resolve that. So for all of the threats and risks that are out there that could be faced by your company, and maybe a threat and a risk could be that you have the majority of your business coming from a single customer, or maybe Pareto's law falls that 20% of your clients represent 80% of your business. Well, that's a business risk associated with this, and would still fall into the crisis if suddenly you lost one of those major accounts. So in thinking about this, as we focus on it, this whole area is where you start. It's the predictive portion of predict, plan, perform, and looking at the crisis. The time to design a crisis management plan is not in the middle of the crisis. However, if you find yourself there, that's when we want you to reach out to Firestorm, and we'll certainly be there with you to help and manage and go forward. So the way that this is done is following the predict, plan, perform process in each of these areas. There are 5 common failures that you can think about within your business that could give rise to a crisis. The most common is critical supply chain failure. Today, across the board, we find that organizations only own 10 or 15% of their supply chain. That means you have an 85 to 90% dependence on a third party. Who are your sole suppliers? Who are your critical suppliers? What would happen if they're not available? Are you sole source? If you are, then that's a potential point of failure within your business. We worked with a defense contractor who made wiring harnesses for guided missile systems, and they were a subcontractor to a large defense contractor. But in looking at it, they had a brass component that held the wires together that was made only by one firm in San Francisco. So they had a particular exposure that if that firm didn't get them this key component, they couldn't make the wiring harnesses, and then the larger contractor couldn't deliver the missiles to carry forward for a government contract. It all came down to a small brass fitting. So identifying those points becomes critical. The second most common failure is failure to train employees for working at home. 70% of employees don't know what they're supposed to do in a disaster or crisis, and 95% don't have a disaster plan at home, and it comes back to that home planning area that we talked about earlier. Third is failure to identify and monitor all threats and risks. We find many times the obvious ones, the winter storms that are currently going on now, would be an easy identifier. But what about workplace violence? What about communicable illness? And we mean more than the Ebola and the D68 that causes the paralysis. What about the flu season that's out there now? And we've seen staph infections and meningitis and others especially impact this area. And across the board, we find that organizations don't have accurate monitoring systems with predetermined triggers to say, hey, this is starting to occur, we need to take these actions. Fourth is failure to conduct exercises and update plans. If you don't test your plans, you don't know if they're going to work, and many times we'll go and find out that they're out of date. We worked with another company, and they found that, oh, well, that supplier is no longer here, it's now been bought by this, and they weren't even aware of the shift in the support area. And last, failure to have a crisis communications plan. What are your 3 key messages to each stakeholder group for each one of the vulnerabilities and threats that you face? Planning those out in advance will make a difference, and we're going to talk about communications more. So you identify and involve the groups and functions that you see, but you're establishing how you monitor and communicate, because those 2 areas will tell you when to take action and help mitigate the impacts. Now, the crisis impacts vary, and you see essentially there are 4 that can occur. Something can happen to your facility or your building, something can happen to your people, something can happen to your information and data. And you can't turn on the television or pick up a magazine or look at something on the internet and not see the data breach area with over 500 million consumer records in America stolen this year alone, and representing that over 330 million people in America, that means that some people have already experienced multiple theft associated with it. And last, brand and reputation. Now, when something occurs, it generally impacts at least two of these quadrants, because clearly a facility people in a data breach would come back to brand and reputation. A product recall might come in, and that starts out as a brand and reputation area as it would move through within the areas. Now, we talked about this business crisis risk. In the upper left-hand corner, that's all the natural disasters and the events that occur. Those are acute. And that's the area that there's been more planning done in most organizations than any other. The other three quadrants are certainly other crises that you need to be considered, and it starts with a difficult in the bottom right, and then moves to chronic, and then it moves to severe. So as you think about this diagram, in your own mind, draw a line up and down, and that's that pre-crisis to active. At the top, it's an active crisis. At the bottom, it's a pre-crisis. It hasn't occurred yet. If you look to the left, you see its target. It generally hits a particular area, like hitting your building, or it's very complex. It involves it. Those other three quadrants, difficult, chronic, and severe, are an example of what will happen within a business when those areas start to occur. Let me cover these four, and then we'll draw a quick conclusion. So the acute is that natural event, that workplace violence, the cascading. You can see, it's easy to see, it's easy to know this is where we are, here are the things we can do and to counteract it. But the one below that, it hasn't happened yet. It's still a difficult problem. There's some events there, there are lack of controls and business processes, and if it remains continuing, it'll become chronic. It'll become a part of who your organizations are. We see this with sexual harassment that happens in the workplace. Think about the VA, where we had an aging vet population, and suddenly there were delays in getting treatment and service there, and they didn't have the resources to get those handled. In that example, it escalated over to becoming much more complex, and that's the same thing that happens here. Long-term systemic failures, lack of metrics, poor controls that are in place, product recalls, lots of comments and discussion on social media about what's occurring in each of these areas. And in the VA, this is where the paper list started to occur, and the fraud that was occurring within it, and the escalation associated. And then finally, it went the wrong direction here. It becomes severe. And again, this means that third parties come in, regulators, auditors, customers are doing it. Maybe a customer's done an audit of your organization's business continuity or security plans. We're seeing you're a supplier to someone else, and therefore they're looking at you as part of their supply chain to come in place. And in the case of the VA, again, now you see the government coming in and taking over and making significant changes. Social media risk is one of the key indicators from a monitoring standpoint that you need to think about. If you want to build an intelligence network, here's one of the first things that you're going to need, because what's on social media today will be in your business tomorrow. And it becomes a key part of your crisis management plan as you see the monitoring in the onset, and then if you look over in the response and recovery, the monitoring that must take place to guide your actions. So we do this before the event, as it breaks, and then after we're doing the response and recovery and dealing with the consequences. But your people are going to be asking, what should we know? What supplies do we need? Where should we go? What do we do now? What do we say in each of these areas? So a crisis management plan will make a difference in the outcome. It will do things like shortening that recovery time period, and you see the error going from where it started to when it was resolved within that basis. That becomes a critical element for us to be concerned about in each one of these steps as we go forward. And the better the plan, the more that it's known, the more that it's documented, the shorter. You're going to need to ask these questions as you're evolving through it. This will guide the directions that we're going. What's occurred? What's known? What's the plan? What are we monitoring? What are our key messages? Who's the spokesperson? What are our internal and external parties? What are they going to be doing? What are their agendas? Do we engage by counsel? Do we report this to our insurance carrier? How much will we get? And maintaining in those areas. So as you take these initial crisis management actions, you're going to see that it will make a difference in terms of what's there. And having a standardized way in which you attack these will guide your management team as they make these critical decisions as you carry forward. We can do a webinar on any one of these single points because there are details around associated with getting those things done as we move through them. But those are the types of things that your crisis management team must be working with. The social media risk areas that identified hazard by OSHA, but this is the key linchpin in designing your intelligence network. What is your program in which you're going to be able to carry that about and getting it known? And we'd love to help you in those areas. As we think about communications and as we start to come together at the end, we've all turned on and seen someone in the middle of a crisis making statements that you're going, are you kidding me? And when you say that you see these types of things happening over and over, we want to ask you to stop before you ever communicate and identify the why. For those of you who've had children or have relatives with children and they come to your house and you're dealing with a 4-year-old, a 5, a 6, or a year-old, and they're saying, and you make a statement, they go, why? And then you answer that, and then they go, why? And then they answer it, ask it again, and then you go, they say why, and you give another answer. If you're in a crisis, there's a tendency to over-communicate and to communicate about things that you want to have occurred, things that you want to think will happen next, as opposed to what you know. Anytime you are explaining in a crisis, you're losing. So what you want to focus on in the predict phase is internally with your people, you're going to want to discuss what happens next. You do not want to be going out yet to an external third party. A plan is, a high-level view of the plan and process that you're going to be doing to carry forward. You're going to go look at your plan and say, how do we change it here? What do we need to do? And then in the perform, what do we need to do and say now? In most cases, you don't need to say anything now. You find those comments, particularly remember the first 24 hours, most of what you learn is wrong, and you make those statements, you're going to see a difference in outcome. So what do you know? Are you concerned? If so, what's your plan? What's your strategy? What are you going to monitor? What are you going to communicate to whom and how as we come together? Communication supports, and I would direct your attention to that middle section here if you find that you must communicate. The first, that you won't be defined by the event. Our company's been around for 30 years. We make these. The fact that we've had this event isn't determining who we are. We're committed to serving our customers, and we're going to put processes in place to make sure that bum, 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 bum. And that's the invent the future then. And then finally, but the most important thing is that our hearts go out to our employees or to our community, and then you talk about that. What you want to do is to always focus on the communicate. Why are we communicating here at this point? It's about the listener. It's about the reader. It's the person who's going to see this message. And we will never say what we think is happening at this point. We're only ever going to state facts. We obviously are going to tell the truth at every step along the way, because the cover-up is always worse than whatever the event or the factors are that are associated with it. So make sure that whoever speaks has had training and is involved in this area as the elements are coming forward. We generally recommend that the senior leader within your company, the president, the owner, isn't the first person who's out making those communications, because the errors are most likely to occur in the first 24-hour period associated with it. So if you're thinking about your crisis communications plan, and those are the key elements as we think about the other aspect of managing the crisis and then communicating about it, and those are two different areas. You focus again under the predict, who is the audience? What are their concerns? If you've had a spill at your plant, the people immediately around you that are in the nearby properties are going to be the ones that have the concerns. So you can go to them directly. That's tailoring the message, the messenger, and the media or medium. You don't need to talk to third parties generally through the media. The more you do that, the higher the risk is associated. You already know how to reach your key customers. You already know how to reach your key suppliers. You already know how to reach and communicate with your key employees. You don't want to talk to them through the media. You want to talk with them directly. You'll be significantly better off, and the person with the relationship, if there's a salesperson or if there's someone on your staff that knows them better, they're going to be the primary contact that will make a difference. And you format this to each one of the stakeholders. Maybe it's an email. The problem with anything that's ever in writing is it's going to be discoverable. Perhaps it might be better reaching out with a phone call and sharing the information. Or if it's a key account, we helped a recycler, publicly traded company, who had a series of problems that occurred due to some internal issues around fraud, and they went and established meetings face-to-face and brought a senior leader with them to each one of their key clients to say, this is what's occurred, this is what we've done, and this is how we know it won't happen in the future, and this is how we'll make you whole in the process. So developing that and focusing on the key messages becomes extremely critical. Also, when you're looking at a crisis, it's how do you know if you did a good job or not? What are the metrics that you used? And Firestorm has a maturity model for crisis management, and you'll see we focus on the decision processes, the roles and responsibilities, the information clarity, the speed of decision-making, and communications effectiveness. As you're testing your plan and you do a test exercise, I would recommend that you go through a similar type of rating of how did we do as a management team, so we don't have to experience this for the first time in a live crisis. So our takeaways today and the lessons learned that we've got is focus on the why when you communicate. Tell the truth. Don't spin. Focus on those key messages. Here are the home bases. You can go and identify those in advance, and those will be the fallback areas that you will talk with, and you have to monitor what's going on. What people are saying about you, your firm, and about the situation on social media will drive what occurs next. That's the intelligence network foundation about which we're talking. We also have additional tools that we can go back and look at the person who's making the postings, find out who their sphere of influence is. We can set up a geofence around a location or a problem and identify everyone who's communicating within it. And then we even have a time machine that we can go back in time and look at what their postings and comments were over a period of time, and that will give you an indication of where we're coming from. So there's a lot happening here in a variety of areas to be carried forward. If you'd like to know how this relates to your company, you can reach out to the New Jersey MEP or to Firestorm, and we'll be glad to do an assessment of your business continuity or your crisis management plans or your business intelligence network of what needs to be included within that to help in those areas. Our thanks today go out to the New Jersey MEP for making this Crisis Coach webinar series available to you and sharing your information, our information with you today. If you've got questions, you can give us. You can go to firestorm.com and look at /NJ MEP to watch this webinar or past webinars or to register in the future. If you've got questions at that same website, you can fill out a contact form and we'll be back in touch with you. Or you can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com or give us a call at 800-321-2219. We've covered a lot of ground today. There are a lot of lessons to learn from a crisis. Our goal is to help prepare you today before an event occurs tomorrow. Unfortunately, there will be a company in the United States that will have a problem today. There'll be more companies that will have problems tomorrow. The worst disaster you'll ever see is the one that affects you and your company, and we'd like to help you with that crisis process. Blair will be in touch with those who've attended today to answer any questions. We appreciate your time and look forward to speaking with you again next month on another topic. Have a great day. Stay warm. It's cold out there today. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Goodbye.